All right, let's look at what the Apostle Paul did when he had encounters with governmental authorities. First of all, Acts chapter 16. Now, the reason it's significant in terms of Paul here is because the Apostle Paul is the one who wrote Romans 13 telling us to obey and submit to governing authorities, and he's the one that said there is no authority except from God. So if they're there, they're from God. Well, again, we've already seen that in that's verses 1 and 2, but in 13, 3 through 5, he qualifies what a governmental authority is. One who's a servant of God doing God's work and punishing those who do evil and praising those who do good. But Acts 16 now, verses 35 through 40. Notice this. Paul and Silas had been in prison. This is the story of the Philippian jailer. And Paul and Silas were released by an angel. And the Philippian jailer was about to kill himself. And Paul and Silas says, hey, no, don't worry about it. We're still here. And and they led him to Christ, and in fact went, and also his family apparently, and those in his household became believers as well. But now it says in verse 35, now when day came, the chief magistrates, who had put him in prison in the first place, sent their policemen, saying, release those men. Now this is not in Jerusalem, this is in Philippi. This is secular governmental authorities now who have Paul and Silas in prison. And they're saying, release those men. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the chief magistrates, by the way, after they went home with them and spoke to their families and all, then they went back to jail. They weren't trying to get out of jail in this case. They could have walked away, but that wasn't what God's will was for them. They stayed. They went back to jail so as to not get the Philippian jailer in trouble. He would have died if Paul and Silas had walked away. They would have been executed. He would have been executed. So he came and he told Paul, he says, the chief magistrates have sent to release you. Now therefore come out and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us in public without trial. They were beaten before they were put in jail and put in the stocks. Men who are Romans. Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. Even though Paul was a Jew, he was a Roman citizen. He was actually born a Roman citizen. He says, and they have thrown us into prison without trial. And now they are sending us away secretly. Now who is sending them away secretly? Who's trying to just release them and get rid of the problem? The governmental authorities who put them in prison, beat them and put them in prison without trial. They didn't even follow their own laws, but they had the power and they had the quote-unquote authority to do it. And they did it, but he says, now they're trying to send us away secretly? No, indeed. Now here's the governmental authority saying, get out of here, go. And he's saying, I'm not going. He says, but let them come themselves. Instead of you, the Philippian jailer, giving us this message, let them come and bring us out. And the policeman reported these words to the chief magistrates. The policeman who was the messenger, he goes back to the magistrates and says, those guys, they won't leave unless you come. You have to come and release them. Because here's what they said. They said that you beat them without trial and they're Roman citizens and you put them in prison. And they, the magistrates, the officials, the governmental authority, they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, that these men were Romans. And they came and appealed to them. The governmental authorities now coming and appealing to Paul and Silas, and when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. Now, Paul was a good, submissive person to governmental authority. According to most Christians' interpretation of what Paul wrote, if he said, okay, Christians, I wrote it, God told me what to write, and I know what it means, but whatever you say it means, I'll go along with. What would the counsel of the Christian world be to these two guys? Number one, they should have left immediately when they were told to leave. Number two, they shouldn't have challenged the magistrates. And number three, when the magistrates did come and say, we told you to leave, they shouldn't have to beg them. Paul and Silas should just obey, right? The magistrates are begging them to leave. And when they went out of prison and entered the house of Lydia, they didn't leave town. And when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them, and then they departed. They left in their own sweet time. Now, by the way, what difference did it make that they were Romans? Philippi was, of course, a Roman province. It was under Roman authority. What difference did it make that they were Romans? Anybody know?
They had special rights.
Romans, citizens of the Roman Empire, had rights, not privileges. They had rights. And you couldn't violate their rights. You could violate other people's rights if you were Romans. You know, you could just trample over people without violating your law. But they had rights. And Paul was calling it to attention that they had rights and that they had had their rights violated, and he turned it around on them. He didn't just go along with them. All right, now look at Acts 22, verses 22 through 30. Acts 22, 22 through 30. I'm not taking time to read the whole account of all the stuff that's going on, but there's much effort on the part of the Jews to get Paul imprisoned and to silence him. So he is now he's been offering a defense to the people, and it says, and they listened to him up to this statement. That he was sent to the Gentiles to preach his message to the Gentiles. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. Kill him. Let's kill him. Okay? And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, they're throwing a tantrum, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, and stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they, the Jews, were shouting against him that way. This is a Roman commander now. Okay? And they are making this huge fuss, and he's saying, okay, well, let's find out what's going on. So instead of interrogating the people making this disorderly fuss, he's going to scourge Paul and make him talk to find out just what's going on here. Now, do you know what scourging is? It's whipping, but it's worse than whipping. A scourge was a whip that had sharp pieces of metal and glass embedded into the leather thongs, and they would rip the flesh from the back in very short order, from the backs of those that were whipped. And so it was a form of torture, in this case, to get them to talk. So this Roman commander says, okay, let's scourge him and get him to talk. We'll find out why these people are so mad. And when they had stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, I love this, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? Now, under Roman law, you could scourge a guy if he had been tried and convicted and sentenced to scourging. Okay? But he was uncondemned. He had not been tried and convicted of anything. And he's about to be scourged. And this Jew says to him, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? Well, the guy was clearly a governing authority. He was the guy who had government authority where he was to do this. He was if you will, a high-up policeman. He was more than a policeman. And when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander, his commander above him, and told him, saying, what are you about to do? Because he was doing it under orders. For this man is a Roman. All of a sudden now, this is different. This isn't just some Jew that they can push around. This is a Roman citizen. But if a Roman citizen is a Christian, isn't he supposed to obey the governing authorities? What business does he have challenging the governing authority? He should just obey and shut up, shouldn't he? Not according to Paul, apparently not. The commander came and said to him, Paul, tell me, are you a Roman? And Paul said, yes. And the commander answered, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. The commander was a Roman citizen too, but he bought his. And Paul said, but I was actually born a citizen. citizens who are born citizens are even a little bit higher and better in citizenship than those that can acquire citizenship, who didn't start out as natural citizens, but got it some other way. Therefore, those who are about to examine him, the word examine there means scourge him and force him to talk, okay? Immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid. This is a guy who could have killed Paul if he'd just been any old Jew. And he would have been within the boundaries of his of the law that he was operating under as a governor. He would have had authority to just kill him, scourge him to death if he wanted to. But when he found out he was a Roman, he immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. Put him in chains without being condemned. Put him in chains without trial or cause. You ever heard the expression in the United States, probable cause? What's your probable cause for stopping me? Technically, according to the law of our land, you can't be arrested without probable cause. In fact, it has to be demonstrated that there is a probable cause for you to be arrested. And by the way, anytime you're stopped, you're being arrested, technically. Even though they might put handcuffs on you and drag you away and put you behind bars, you are arrested as long as you're kept from proceeding, let's say if you're driving or whatever. But in any case, there are certain rules and laws that are supposed to be followed. And Paul is pointing out to them that they are violating the law themselves. Why doesn't he just as a good Christian lay down and say, whatever you say, boys, you're governing authorities. You wouldn't even be here if God hadn't put you here. What they were doing was not lawful. His question was, is it lawful? Clearly it wasn't lawful. He knew it wasn't lawful for them to be scourging a man who was a Roman who had not been convicted and sentenced to that punishment. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down and set him before them. So he's saying, okay, let's have a meeting here and find out what all this fuss is about. Now, going on in chapter 23, Acts 23, verses 1 through 11, he says, And Paul, looking intently at the council, said, Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Ananias was the high priest. And he ordered his guard standing by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And do you sit to try me according to the law, referring in this case to God's law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? See, this was even in violation not just of Roman law, but of God's law. But the bystanders said, Do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, and he quotes the scripture, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now he spoke to him in a very, what might otherwise be considered kind of a snotty way, didn't he? He didn't speak particularly respectfully to him at that point, did he? Now, was what Paul said wrong? The words he said in saying what he said to this man, were the words wrong? Is what he said wrong in and of itself? No, what he said was correct. He didn't know that it was the high priest. And it would appear that had he known it was the high priest, he would have perhaps chosen a different way of saying it, instead of speaking in a disrespectful fashion. Now, people take this to mean, see, he knew he was wrong. He's supposed to obey the governing authorities and shouldn't have said what he said. Well, let's read on. But perceiving that one party of the people that were having this meeting were Sadducees and the other Pharisees. You see, the Sadducees were the liberals of the day. The Pharisees were the conservatives. Now, they were all unbelievers, for the most part. And I think you can effectively say every one of these people were unbelievers. But the Pharisees were those who had a relatively conservative approach to God's Word, and the Sadducees had a liberal approach to God's Word, even though neither of them truly down deep believed it or trusted in God. So Paul began crying out on the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." Now he's talking there about the message he's preaching of hope and salvation and resurrection in Jesus Christ. Now, in identifying himself with the Pharisees and with the resurrection, he's identifying something the Pharisees give lip service to believing in. You see, the Pharisees, well, let's see if they mention it here. It says, "And he said, as he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit." See, that's the liberals. The liberals say, it's all figurative. There's no real spirit realm. God isn't even real. It's just a matter of your moral choices. But the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Liberals today deny the resurrection. They don't even believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, let alone that we are going to have life after death with a resurrection. By the way, the resurrection after death is not just for believers. Unbelievers will also be resurrected. But liberals deny that. Liberals say it just all ends up as dust in the grave. All that matters is what goes on now. But the conservatives, they believe in these doctrines, even if they don't personally trust God and haven't been saved. They believe certain facts. Okay? So the Pharisees, they believed that in the resurrection and angels and spirits. Verse 9, "Now there arose a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, 'We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him.' And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid, and Paul would be torn to pieces. The commander would be the Roman commander now. That Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and to bring him into the barracks." Now, Paul challenged the lawfulness of what happened to him in being struck and treated the way he's being treated in this hearing, though he apparently backed off on the way he said what he did when he found out he was the high priest. But does that mean that he shouldn't have said anything at all, or that what he had said was simply totally wrong? Look at verse 11 now. It says, "But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at Paul's side, and said, 'Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, you must be a witness at Rome also.'" The Lord did not rebuke him and say, "Hey, you were wrong there. You should not have ever said anything to those people that were holding you and interrogating you." After all, they're the governmental authority. And religiously, they were. And they had effectively civil authority as well as religious leaders, even though there was a Roman commander there. Normally, they would have that civil authority. But the Roman commander now has got a whole different view of what's going on because he found out that Paul was a Roman citizen. And now the Roman commander is protecting him from them because they normally would only have civil authority as religious leaders over their own people, the Jews. But in this case, Paul happens to be also a Roman citizen. So the commander was protecting him. But otherwise, these Jews would have authority over him. And again, if you take the way most Christians interpret what Paul wrote in Romans 13, he should have just been going along with whatever they wanted to do, but he didn't. He opposed them. And God did not rebuke him for what he said, and in fact spoke about how he was a good witness. And now he's going to end up in Rome, and he wants him to be a witness there too of the same. Okay, now look also at Acts 24, verse 13. Acts 24:13. Now again, for time, instead of reading the whole account, I'm skipping over. He's been offering a defense, etc. And notice what he says in the midst of all the things that he's saying to defend himself here. He says in verse 13, "Nor can they prove to you the charges," he's speaking to the Roman governor in this case, "nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me." So what? Throughout history, there have been all kinds of people that have been punished and even put to death without proof of charges. But Paul is challenging the legality, challenging the lawfulness of what's going on because they haven't proven the charges. They're accusing them. The accusations are false. But, these days in America, most people believe that if you're accused, you're guilty. They don't believe that you're innocent until proven guilty. In fact, that's how the people tend to function. If you get arrested and you get put in jail and you're being tried for a crime, you don't have to have committed that crime to be guilty in the eyes of the people. The attitude of most people is, well, they wouldn't have arrested him and put him in jail and trying him if he wasn't guilty. But of course, the courts, that's different, right? In the court, you're innocent until proven guilty, right? Wrong. They don't treat it that way anymore. In actual practice, for the most part, you're guilty unless you prove yourself innocent. One friend of ours, it was a simple criminal proceeding of a traffic ticket, but he in his let me use the word conversation in the courtroom in defending himself, he challenged the evidence that was being supposedly put forth, which was no evidence at all that he had committed this crime. And he proved with the officer who was testifying against him, when he was allowed to cross-examine him, he got the guy to admit that he had no proof of anything that he was accusing him of. The only accuser was the witness himself, the policeman. So he got the cop on every single point. Just, do you have proof that you claimed against me? Do you have proof of that? No. And he finally said to the judge, "Judge, I move that you dismiss the charges against me on the grounds that the prosecution has failed to prove a prima facie case against me." This guy had never been in a courtroom before. I don't know where he came up with this, but it was brilliant. And the judge exploded and says, "No, you didn't prove you didn't do it. You're guilty. Go pay the fine." And he hadn't even had a chance to present his side of the case yet. All he was doing is cross-examining during the prosecution side. And the judge says, "You didn't prove you didn't do it. You're guilty. Go pay the fine." Another friend of ours was in a court case in which he had made an objection to something that had happened, and in his objection he referred to justice. And the judge laughed out loud and said, "Mr. So-and-so, if you're looking for justice, you're going to have to go to a higher court than this." Now that's what's going on in our land today. Does God mean for us to just bow down and say, "Oh, you're the governing authorities. God told me to obey no matter what"? Is that what God is asking us to do? Now, by the way, I do believe this. Let me underline something here real strongly. I believe that God means for us to be civil. I believe that God means for us to be respectful of their position, even if they don't deserve it. Like Clinton, he as a man, Clinton does not deserve any respect. But as the President of the United States, in spite of everything that he is as a person, respect should be shown to him. If I'm sitting here talking to you what I think about Bill Clinton, you won't hear me saying things about him that make it sound like I have any respect for him, because I don't. But if he walked into the room, I would probably stand up, and I would probably address him as Mr. President. Now, given the opportunity, I might tell him what I thought of him, but I would do it respectfully. I wouldn't sneer at him and say, "You blankety blank 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 blank," and treat him with disrespect. I don't think anybody in this room would. So I believe that while we, I believe, are biblically correct in saying no to certain actions of those who purport to be governing authorities, and to objecting to what they're doing and resisting at certain points when they're doing things that are wrong, that are not lawful, that are not from God, we still need to do it with respect, and we need to do it with civility. One friend of ours who has far stronger views even than I do in these matters, and to hear him talk just privately about what's going on in this world, you almost kind of cringe. I won't even repeat some of the things he said about what he'd like to do. But when he gets in the courtroom, we've had to say to him, you're going too far at showing respect. You're going so far at showing respect, they're missing the point, because it's your honor, sir, to the point where it's almost effusive. Now, better do that than to be disrespectful and to have an arrogant, fist-shaking kind of an attitude. So we're talking here about the fact that we are not called by God to bow down to just any old supposed governmental authority and any old thing that they say, and that there are times and places where I believe it's God's will for us to say respectfully, no. But that we should do it respectfully. We should do it with a humble attitude rather than an attitude of arrogance. Acts 25, starting at verse 6. Acts 25, beginning at verse 6, verses 6 through 27. It says, "And after he had spent more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought." This is Festus, I believe. It says, and after he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, Paul, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, "I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. If I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know." He said, "I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die." Now that's consistent. Hold your place there and go back to Romans 13 for a moment. Just make sure you understand what's going on here. Romans 13, verses 3 and 4. "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it, the governmental authority and ruler, is a minister or a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it, the ruler or governmental authority, is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." So Paul is saying, hey, if I've done evil, then go ahead and do me in. He says, "If I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them." Now, the governor could get away with doing anything he pleased. He could have handed them over to them and said, "Go kill them." Couldn't he? Just like a lot of judges do these days when they do things to people they shouldn't do. And they get away with it because they operate under the color of law, and the vast, as we read a few weeks ago from Black's Law Dictionary, in opposition to government de jure, the government de facto, the people just go along with it. And they let them get away with stuff. Well, he could have gotten away with it. He could have gone ahead and handed them over them. When he says no one, he says, if in fact these things are not true, which they weren't, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. No one can properly or lawfully hand me over, and if you do, I'm telling you, you're wrong. You can't properly do this. He says, I appeal to Caesar. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You've appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall, you shall go." Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him. They wanted him condemned to death. And I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face, and has had an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. And when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Keeping him in custody, by the way, was not because he was being imprisoned, but because he was being protected, so he wouldn't get killed by these people. And Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so on the next day, when Agrippa had come together with Bernice amid great pomp, and had entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, and at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you behold this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. Since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Now the point is that Paul is not just laying down to whatever the quote-unquote governmental authority would do. He's appealing to what's right, and in this case, what's right under the Roman law. And it is not inappropriate for Christians to do that. What's interesting is I know of one instance where a person is very strong on submitting to governing authorities, and you know, what's interesting is that the tendency is to whatever the government says, you got to obey it. That tends to be the implication. And yet, when the government did something to this individual and those that he represents, which he didn't think was right, he sued him. He went to court and he sued him. He didn't say he sued him, though. He said, we went and asked the judge what he thought about it. So it depends, you know. Everybody again has their own little idea of when and where you can oppose the government and when other people shouldn't and couldn't. I can't do it. Bottom line, if one does ever oppose the government as a Christian, one needs to be convinced in his heart and in his mind that he is opposing the government because to what the government is doing is wrong. And if you're truly convinced of that, then I believe that God's calling you to say something, to oppose. Okay, Acts 26:1. And Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. Now, we'll skip some of what he says, but let's pick up at verse 10 now, verses 10 through 12. It says, and this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, he's giving his testimony. And he's now talking about how he imprisoned the believers in his zeal against the true believers. He says, having received authority from the chief priest. He had authority from the chief priest to lock up people who believed in Jesus Christ. These would be kingdom saints at the time. But also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. The chief priests gave him authority to arrest and put to death, with the vote of the council, put to death people who were believing in Jesus Christ. They hadn't even committed a crime. They just believed in Jesus Christ, and they were being voted to be put to death by the religious rulers. And as I punished them often in the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. meaning tried to get them to speak against Jesus Christ and against God, and being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. And while thus engaged, as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, then he goes on to tell his testimony of how the Lord appeared to him in the vision, in the blinding light, etc. But again, I'm just sharing with you there that the religious authorities that he is opposing in these matters that they're bringing charges against him, and he's standing up against them, clearly are people who have civil as well as religious authority. Acts 28 now, verses 17 through 22. Acts 28, 17 through 22. And it happened after 3 days, he called together those who were the leading men of the Jews, and when they had come together, he began saying to them, Brethren, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And when they had examined me, they were willing to release me, because there was no ground for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any accusation against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel. And they said to him, We have neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any of the brethren come here and reported or spoken anything bad about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are for concerning this sect. For concerning this sect, it is known to us that it is spoken against everywhere. Now, bottom line, what I'm just pointing out there in a lot of these things is Paul is, instead of just bowing down to whatever anybody who is in a position of authority is saying, he is politely saying no, and he's offered a defense, etc. And sometimes it requires a vigorous opposition within the system, and sometimes, if necessary, without. Where sometimes you just have to do like the apostles did, and they didn't have any legal recourse to follow. They just simply said, we're not going to do what you say. We have to obey God. You do with us what you want, but we're going to obey God. Now let me underline something else. If, when it comes to a governmental authority, whether it be a God-ordained and God-placed governmental authority, or a de facto authority, which is not really placed there by God, bottom line, and by the way, if they're asking you, putting you in a position where you have to oppose them, probably they're not a God-ordained authority at that point, not functioning as such. But in any case, if you have to go against them and say no to them, you can follow all the procedures, all the recourse that you have to say no and to oppose. But bottom line, our posture ultimately, I think, has to be in a lot of circumstances. Not in every. There's some circumstances in which I think we might even be called upon to offer resistance. I mean, if necessary, a defensive resistance. You know, if you're out on your farm place and the bad guys are coming after you under the color of law, you know, if it's a matter of defending the life of your wife and children, maybe it would be not inappropriate to offer armed defense. Without getting into all that now, where that might be a circumstance that could come. Long before that, you go through the legal process, etc., and saying no, and making your objections, etc. But bottom line, often it may come to be like with the apostles, where they said, whether you think it's right for us to obey you or obey God, that's for you to decide. We must obey God. Otherwise, you do what you want with us. We're going to obey God. And if you have some basis for doing something otherwise with us, that's up to you. In other words, they still submitted to the consequences of saying no to the governmental authority. And in most cases, I don't think it's appropriate to get into a shootout with the government, as many of these people have done. By the way, let me just say that down at Waco, with what was that bunch called again?
Davidian.
The Branch Davidians. And who was that Messiah guy? What the false Messiah guy? What was his name? Koresh. Those people were not Christians. There may have been among them possibly a deceived Christian here or there that was there. But the organization and what they were teaching and holding was not Christian, even though they used the Bible. So what I'm saying is not a defense of their faith. But what happened to them was totally wrong. And the little bit of shooting back that they did was in self-defense. Under the circumstances, I don't feel was necessarily inappropriate. The government purposed to create an armed conflict with those people. They could have arrested Koresh before they started all the trouble that day. They could have arrested him. He went to town every day to do things. They could have had a non-violent deal. They could have just arrested him. If in fact he'd committed any crimes, they could have arrested him. And the government created that whole situation. So in certain circumstances, sometimes you're forced to defend yourself. But in most cases, I don't believe that having an attitude of, well, we're going to shoot it out with the government is at all what God is calling us to do. And so nothing I've said here is designed to say that is your primary response when things don't go the way you think they ought to go in dealing with the government. I think that bottom line, ultimately, we need to make all the objections that need to be made, and ultimately we may have to suffer for righteousness if that's what it comes to. Again, when it comes to defending one's wife and family, that's a little bit different if there's a threat against them. But if it's just me as an individual, then perhaps I may end up having to go to jail unjustly if that's what it comes to. But in any case, the point we're going for here in all of this is that Romans 13 is not calling us to bow down to any old thing that anybody flashing a badge tells us to do. And that it doesn't only, the line drawn is not only if they happen to be telling us, you have to go against your God. You have to abort your child. That's what a lot of people that are they're against the anti-abortion activists, but they say, well, if they tell you have to abort your child, then you have to say no to the government. Well, I would certainly agree that at that point you have to say no to the government. But I wouldn't draw the line there necessarily. I think there's a lot of places we should be drawing the line a lot earlier. We should not automatically be just deferring to any old jurisdiction that they want to impose on us if in fact that jurisdiction does not apply to us. Because there's a lot of times that we will give in, inadvertently and ignorantly give in to claims that they'll make against us, where they'll lure the government. Remember last week afterwards in our discussion we were talking about the two different, the lawful constitutional government and then the secret one that they put together. They deceive people and get people underneath this other government, which was not really intended by the Constitution to begin with when our government was established. And sometimes we need to be saying no to that and saying, no, I don't choose to volunteer to be under that jurisdiction. And it is voluntary. And it's appropriate sometimes for us to say no, where other Christians look and say, oh, no, you need to bow down, you need to do whatever they say. Go ahead and just give them jurisdiction and tell them, go along with the school authorities if they'll give you permission to home educate. The trouble is they give you permission to home educate today, they can take away that permission tomorrow. And if you've said, yeah, I'm asking you for permission today, then tomorrow you can't say, well, I'm sorry, God told me to do this, so I'm going to do it. You can say that, but they would have a lawful and a legal basis for then taking you to court and putting you in jail for not going along with them if they tell you to stop educating your children at home. So in all of this, the point is that Romans 13, and we're out of time here now, we'll pick up just some trail end comments on this next week. But Romans 13, 1 through 5 is not saying you must bow down to any old thing the government tells you to do. And we're out of time, so I can't do it, but we're going to turn to next week to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and see what attitude we should have toward the government in all of this, even if they're wrong, what attitude we should have. And it should be one of indeed praying for those that are in positions of authority, even if they're not God-ordained authorities. We should be praying for them. We'll see that next week. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for what you've shown us this evening. Pray, Lord, that you would truly open our minds and our hearts to receive and understand these things, and that we might have a balanced view of